Recently, a novel called Shy Girl hit the news after it was reported to have been generated using AI. Once that came to light, the publisher pulled it from the shelves and all hell broke loose. And by all hell, I mean the internet. Interneted. AI and fiction seem to bring out the absolute extremes in people. On one side, you have those saying, this is obviously the future, and anyone resisting it is deluded. On the other, you have people treating it as the death of fiction itself. And, unsurprisingly, most videos out there plant their flag firmly in one camp or the other. So, what I'm aiming to do in this video is something slightly more dangerous, that is, look at both sides of the argument properly. Because I don't think this is just a tech story, it's a story about creativity, money, ownership, and more than a few uncomfortable questions sitting quietly underneath it all. But first, let's start with the obvious question. Why would a writer want to use AI in the first place? The answer can seem pretty simple. Most people imagine AI writers as lazy scammers, churning out hundreds of books, flooding the market, trying to make quick money, and making life harder for real authors. And to be fair, that does happen, and will likely happen more. There are people using AI to mass-produce books for profit, pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But I also think the truth is much greyer and more complicated than that. Because once you look a bit more closely, not every person using AI to write is doing the exact same thing, and not all of them are coming from the same place. Many people who have self-published multiple AI-assisted books say they do care deeply about the stories they are telling. Many, despite using AI, say they worked on those stories for a long time and insist the stereotype of churning out thousands of words a day is just not true. And in many cases, we are not even talking about books that are fully AI generated from beginning to end. A lot of the time, it is messier than that. You might have a human writing some sections entirely themselves, using AI to improve a sentence here or there, using it to rewrite awkward phrasing or dropping in a generated paragraph and then editing it heavily afterwards. Other people use it less to generate text and more as a brainstorming partner, sounding board or editor. And that is part of what makes this whole subject so difficult to untangle. The lines between these different uses are blurry. Where exactly does using AI as a tool end and letting AI write for you begin? People draw that line in very different places. When I was researching this video, one thing kept coming up again and again. A lot of the people using AI to write do not lack ideas. Quite the opposite. Many seem to have stories and characters inside them that they care deeply about, but for one reason or another, they do not feel capable of writing them on their own. Now, some people would say that simply means they lack the skill, and if they lack the skill, they have no business using AI to do it for them. But I think what often sits underneath that is not just a lack of skill, it is a lack of confidence, a fear of even beginning, a fear of trying to write in their own words. In other words, they are scared of writing badly, scared of not being able to get onto the page the version of the story they can see so clearly in their own mind. And I do think we have built a culture where that fear makes sense. For years, fiction writing has been treated almost like a test. People absorb the idea that writing is either good or bad, and the proof of which one you are lies in whether you become a published author or not. Unless what you make is good enough to sit on a shelf beside books by people who have been doing this for years, it can start to feel as though you are not really a writer at all. Of course, that is not the full truth. Publishing is not a pure system where the most beautifully written book always wins. Agents and publishers acquire books they believe will sell in the current market. A novel with imperfect prose can get published, while a brilliant, beautifully written manuscript can still go nowhere. The deciding factor is often not simply quality, but whether the book feels marketable at that particular moment in time. Take Moby Dick, for example. It is seen as one of the great American novels now, but a sprawling, genre-bending whale novel, full of philosophy, catalogues and sermons is exactly the kind of manuscript that an agent today might admire, while still having no idea how to sell it. But that is almost beside the point, because if you grow up believing that the goal of writing is not expression or discovery, but producing a publishable book, then AI must seem incredibly tempting. Because suddenly, instead of spending years learning, struggling, and risking failure, there is a tool promising to help you reach that goal much faster. Writing a book the traditional way takes a huge amount of time, not just writing the first draft, but learning the craft, improving, rewriting, failing, and getting better. That can take years. So I can understand why some people look at AI and think, if I have this story in me now and I may never have the time, skill, energy, or life circumstances to do it all the traditional way, is it really so wrong to use a machine to help me finally express it? Because if somebody has a story they desperately want to tell, but their circumstances mean they may never get the chance to develop the skills to tell it unaided, are we really saying that story should simply die with them? And I do think there is a question there about who gets the time, support, and opportunity to develop as a writer. Generally speaking, people with more money and stability often have a far better chance of developing their writing to the level the industry expects. Of course, that will not be true in every single case, and sometimes "I don't have time" may simply be a convenient excuse to avoid doing the hard part. But when people say AI removes gatekeepers from creativity, I think this is partly what they mean. It offers a way in for people who might otherwise feel shut out, not because they lack imagination, but because they lack the resources, time, or confidence to develop that imagination in the traditional way. And I think that is one of the reasons this debate gets so emotional, because underneath all the arguments about publishing and craft and ethics, there is also something very human here. People wanting to make something and feeling afraid they cannot do it alone. And that is why I think it is too simple to paint every AI-assisted writer as lazy, cynical, or talentless. Some are undoubtedly chasing money, some are cutting corners, but many seem to be reaching for AI because they want to create and do not yet believe they are allowed to do it imperfectly. But with that said, there is a cost to using AI, and I think before we can decide whether it is helping writers or quietly flattening what makes writing human, we need to look honestly at what AI can actually do and what it can't. AI does not create from nowhere. It works by learning patterns from huge amounts of human-made material and then recombining those patterns into new outputs. That is part of what makes it so controversial. A lot of people object to the fact that these systems were trained on human-created work, often without the creator's permission, and ask whether that amounts to theft. I'm not going to get too far into that side of things here, but it is worth knowing that this debate exists. The same goes for the environmental cost. AI uses large amounts of water, electricity, and computing power. Of course, most things we do in modern life carry some environmental cost somewhere along the line, but again, it is worth noting. Now, if you look at creativity a certain way, AI can seem incredibly impressive. There is a long-standing argument that there are no completely new ideas in the world. Creativity is often about taking existing influences, themes and styles and recombining them in a fresh way. Austin Kleon talks about this in Steal Like an Artist. He argues that if something appears new and exciting to you, it is often because you have simply not seen the influences behind it. And if that is true, then you can see why some people look at AI and think perhaps creativity is not some mysterious sacred force after all. Perhaps it is, to some extent, a system of patterns, an equation that a machine can handle as well as, or even better than, a human. But this is where I think we have to slow down a bit, because even if creativity does involve recombination, that does not necessarily mean all recombination is equal. And this is where AI starts to show its limits. It can spit out ideas, but it does not really have taste or judgment the way a human does. It struggles to know which idea is alive and which is dead, which is too safe, too neat, too obvious. In other words, it struggles to know a good idea from a bad one. It is also built to be safe for people to use. It has moral lines it does not like to cross, and that can flatten and soften ideas. It tends to drift toward what is broadly acceptable, broadly coherent, broadly pleasing. So it can make your prose feel like the literary equivalent of nice hotel art, competently made, easy enough to look at but not unique, and not likely to haunt anyone for years afterwards. From what I've seen of AI fiction writing, it produces technically tidy prose. It can give you very coherent, polished, clean sentences, but it is almost too polished, like it has been cleaned to the point that nothing of worth is left. And that is because fiction often lives or dies on things that are much harder to mechanize. Things like voice, emotion, weirdness, moral mess, even the mistakes or quirks of an author, the bits that make the writing feel alive. That, to me, is where AI still feels weak. It can imitate, it can smooth, but I am much less convinced that it can originate in the same way a human can. That is why I think it helps to stop imagining AI as some kind of genius novelist. A better way to think of it might be as an eager intern, quick, capable, keen to help, but needing a lot of direction, a lot of correction, and a lot of supervision. And that leads to a strange irony. Because many of the people turning to AI for writing seem to be doing it because they lack confidence in their own ability, but to use AI well, you actually need quite a lot of confidence, ability, and taste in the first place. You need to be able to look at what it gives you and say, no, that is too obvious. No, that is too flat. No, that sentence may be technically better, but it has lost the life of the original. In other words, you cannot really treat AI as a genius and take everything it gives you as gospel. If you do, you are much more likely to end up with something generic and bland. And there is another irony there too. If getting good prose out of AI takes time, patience, and the skill to guide it properly, then would that time not be better spent actually writing and developing those skills for yourself? Of course, this is all describing the situation as it stands now today. AI may keep improving, it may get better at producing prose, it may get easier and easier to use to a high level even by someone unskilled. And if that happens, I can completely understand why people in publishing, and writers themselves, are nervous. Because the more capable these tools become, the more they seem to threaten human writing altogether. And that is where the pushback really begins. A lot of people feel that fiction should be human and human only, that reading a novel is not just about consuming words on a page, it is about spending time inside another mind. And if the words were generated by a machine rather than shaped by a person, then for many readers, something important feels lost. And I understand that. I do not want to live in a world where all the fiction I read is written by a machine. When you think about the hundreds of years of human creativity and authorship behind us, the idea that we could be moving towards the end of that feels deeply sad. And authors are right to be worried. What if AI gets so good at writing fiction that publishers simply generate and release their own books without involving a human author at all? Though that does not seem to be happening anytime soon. At the moment, many agents and publishers are holding a strong anti-AI line. But the backlash is not just moral panic. There are real business and legal reasons for it too. From a publisher's point of view, a book is not only a piece of art, it is also an asset, something they need to be able to own, market, license and sell. And if a manuscript contains AI-generated material, that raises awkward questions. Who really authored it? How much of it can be claimed as original? And, importantly, which parts can be legally protected? At the moment, the US Copyright Office says that copyright protection attaches to the human-authored parts of a work, not to machine-generated outputs simply because someone typed a prompt. So these are not abstract worries. They affect contracts, rights, risk and money. And that is why we are now seeing all sorts of attempts to sort, label and police this new blurry territory. There are AI detection tools. This is what reportedly alerted publishers to Shy Girl when the CEO of Pangram ran the book through his software. But AI detectors have been widely criticized for false positives. Text from books published years before AI existed has been flagged as AI generated when that is obviously impossible. I couldn't personally find any conclusive proof that agents or publishers are widely using this kind of software themselves. These are people who read a vast amount of manuscripts every year, and many insist that they do not need detectors because they can spot AI writing for themselves. They also argue that because AI tends to produce bland writing, it is not something they would be likely to pick up anyway. The number one thing agents and publishers want is a unique voice, the exact thing AI still seems to struggle with. In the case of Shy Girl, this was a book that had already been self-published and sold well before Hachette picked it up for re-release, which is supposedly how it slipped under the radar. The Authors Guild has also introduced a human-authored mark for books where no AI was used to write them, which on the surface sounds sensible, a bit like an ingredients label on a food packet, allowing readers to make a more informed choice. But in reality, from what I can gather, it is a paid certification scheme for non-members. The author pays a fee, signs a disclosure saying they did not use AI, and the label is applied to the book. The problem is that it still depends on the author being truthful, because there is no actual foolproof way to know whether an author used AI in any part of the process or not. So to me, a human-authored mark sounds less like a real safeguard and more like a marketable badge of reassurance. I don't think it's the answer. But this is not the first time in history that creative industries have panicked over a new tool. When photography first appeared, many traditional artists dismissed it because of its dependence on technology. Suddenly, you didn't have to practice painting for years to produce an image. You could capture one with the click of a button. At the time, I can completely see why that would have felt like cheating, and yet photography did not destroy art. It changed the creative world, reshaped what painting was for, and altered what artists did. But it did not eradicate painting. Now, I am not saying AI is exactly the same, and I am not saying the outcome will be the same either, but there is a familiar pattern here. Usually a new technology appears. Many people resist it. Some early adopters gain an advantage. And eventually, whether people like it or not, the tool becomes part of the normal landscape, even if it changes the industry around it. And the photography analogy raises another interesting point. Just because someone owns a camera, that does not instantly make them a good photographer. They still need an eye, taste, judgment, a sense of what is worth capturing and how. And I think AI raises a similar and slightly uncomfortable idea for writers. Many of us like to believe that to become a good writer, all we have to do is put in the hours, work hard, build the skill, and eventually we will be rewarded for that effort. But tools like cameras, and perhaps tools like AI, force us to confront the fact that hard work might not be the whole equation, that taste and judgment might matter just as much, and that can feel deeply unfair. Because someone may have strong judgment, strong instincts, strong taste, and with the help of a tool they may be able to produce something powerful without putting in the same years of technical practice that someone else has. Meanwhile, another person may have spent years working on the craft but still not have that same eye and lack the same level of success. I think part of what unsettles people about AI is that it forces that uncomfortable truth into the open. But all of this leads to a much deeper question. What is writing actually for? Because I think your answer to that changes almost everything. If you see writing mainly as a product, then AI starts to make a lot of sense. A book becomes a finished object, something to publish and sell. And if the goal is to end up with a book in your hand, ideally as quickly and efficiently as possible, then of course a tool that helps you get there faster is going to look appealing. But that is only one way of looking at writing. The other way is to see writing as a process. Not just a route to a finished product, but something valuable in itself. A way of discovering yourself, of finding meaning, a way of exploring feelings, ideas and questions that you can't do in any other area of life. And if that is what writing is, then the equation changes. Because then the point is not simply to have written a book, the point is the writing of it. It's a bit like knitting a jumper. You could ask, why spend hours knitting a jumper when you could just buy one? And the answer, of course, is that for many people, the point is the knitting, the making, the process. You knit not because you want a jumper, but because you want to knit. And I think this debate runs deeper than technology, because we've built a culture where almost every hobby gets monetized eventually. Everything we used to create for fun, freedom, or expression becomes content, or a side hustle, or a product, or a possible income stream. And once that happens, the meaning of the activity starts to shift. Writing is no exception, and it's where AI becomes extremely tempting. Because if the finished book is the goal, then why would you not use the quickest and most efficient tool available to help you get there? But if the point of writing is the act itself, then handing too much of that process over to a machine starts to feel very different. Because what you are losing is not just the labour, it is part of the meaning. And I think that is why some people feel so strongly about this, not because they are old-fashioned or anti-technology or trying to gatekeep creativity, but because they believe that writing is not just about producing words. It is about expressing something only a human being can express by wrestling with language, thought and feeling over time. Personally, I think of the Horcruxes in Harry Potter. Voldemort hides pieces of his soul within them to achieve immortality. That's a little how I think about writing. A writer puts a piece of themselves into every story. We cannot speak to Mary Shelley or Tolkien or Charles Dickens anymore, but we still have their minds on the page. Part of them is still here, and there is something incredible in that. That is why I think writing matters so much. It is a way of leaving a trace of yourself behind, a way of making something that carries your voice, your mind, your way of seeing the world. And I think that is what gets lost, at least partly, when AI starts doing too much of the writing. Because it is you I want to feel in the words, your viewpoint, your strangeness, your personality, the things only you would notice and only you would choose to say in quite that way. Because it is not perfection I want from a writer, it is presence. That does not mean everyone has to see it that way. Plenty of people will say the finished book is what matters most, and the process is secondary. But I do think a lot of this debate comes down to that difference. Whether you believe writing is mainly about producing a book, or about expressing something only a human being can express by struggling their way through it. But there is another possibility here, and I think it's a hopeful one. AI may not destroy human creativity at all. It may simply force us to see more clearly what it was valuable for in the first place. Because before AI, many of us had started to believe that the goal of creativity was perfection, polished, refined, optimized work that looked finished. And the more perfect something appeared, the more we were taught to value it. Now, suddenly, we have a tool that can produce that polish almost instantly. It can smooth, tidy, correct, and make something sound more complete than it really is. And because of that, I wonder if what we admire might begin to shift, because if technically perfect writing becomes cheap and easy, then it stops feeling special. And what stands out instead is something messier, stranger, more vulnerable, something with rough edges, something that feels alive, something human. And I think that could be a good thing, because for a long time, people have been too intimidated to create at all. Creativity has started to feel like performance, as though there's no point making anything unless it's already impressive. But maybe AI breaks that illusion. After all, the easiest way to stand out in a crowd of AI-generated content is to simply not use AI at all and make something imperfect and human. That, to me, is the hopeful possibility in all of this. That AI may not kill human creativity at all. It may actually remind us why it mattered in the first place. Looking ahead, AI will almost certainly get better at writing fiction, but not necessarily because anyone is trying to turn it into the next great novelist. The real money in AI isn't in novels. It's in business tools, coding, enterprise systems, the kinds of things that scale, automate, and save companies time and money. That's where the focus is. Fiction, in a way, just comes along for the ride. As these systems get better at language, structure, and reasoning, they become better at storytelling too. Not by design exactly, but as a kind of side effect. That said, I think there is a market for AI in storytelling, just not quite in the way people imagine. It's less about replacing authors and more about creating new kinds of experiences. Interactive stories, games, personalized narratives that shift and respond in real time. And for writers themselves, AI may not replace the role, but it may quietly become an accepted part of the process as a tool. An assistant, something that helps shape the work rather than define it. So perhaps the future isn't AI instead of authors, but AI sitting just beside them. The question is, how do we feel about that? Do you think AI will change fiction in a meaningful way, or will it simply fade into the background as just another tool? Let me know what you think in the comments.